Good morning or afternoon, everyone, depending on your time zone. And thanks, everyone, for joining us for this conversation today. I'm James Temple. I'm a writer for MIT Technology Review, where I cover climate and clean energy and decarbonization. And I've been writing more about negative emissions and soil carbon lately. We're here to discuss that topic as it's generating a growing amount of attention among policymakers, the agricultural industry, corporations, and soil and climate researchers, and folks like me in the media. The idea is that we could potentially use soil to capture and store a growing amount of carbon dioxide as one means of combating the effects of climate change, and to produce potentially offsets that other companies can purchase to balance out their own greenhouse gas emissions. The science is pretty clear that we can capture a whole lot more carbon in the world's soils, billions of tons annually, perhaps, through certain practices like planting certain types of cover crops between seasons that would suck up CO2 in the air as they grow, and then add nutrients and carbon back to the soil when they're plowed under, which improves soil health and helps store away more carbon. But there's a big debate underway about, and some amount of uncertainty about, how much additional carbon actually gets stored and for how long, depending on the soil type and climate conditions, techniques used, and bunch of other things. And so that's creating that creates complications when we get to the questions of how do we measure and verify additional uptake, and how do we appropriately compensate farmers or otherwise incentivize them to take these sorts of steps. So today we have a few people here to talk through some of those issues. We have Aliza Wasserman-Drewes, who is Director of Rural Investment to Protect Our Environment, or RIPE. RIPE is it's a nonprofit that's pushing for climate policies that support sustainable farming practices and find ways to compensate farmers for their contributions to air, water, and soil health. We also have Dan Blaustein-Rejto, Director of the Food and Agricultural Program at the Breakthrough Institute, which is a research group that promotes technological solutions to environmental challenges, and is also the host of today's event. And finally, we have Phil Gordon, who is the owner of Gordon Valley Farms and Vice President of the Michigan Corn Growers Association, who is actively himself trying to implement certain sustainable practices on his land to protect the environment. I'm going to ask the various panelists a few questions now, but if you have questions for them, please type them into the Q&A box, and we will be sure to get to those a little later in the program. So Phil, I'd love to start with you. Can you just sort of describe some of the changes you've undertaken on your farm, particularly for in regards to additional carbon uptake, why you've done it, and what it's meant for your farm so far?
I've gone to no-till farming, and a lot of this comes because 50 years ago, no, about 40 years ago, when I was plowing, I kept questioning if I was accomplishing anything. And I tried no-till and tried different things and realized that I was out there and what I did not accomplish anything. So for about I'm 71 years old, by the way. For the last 20 years, I've been totally no-till and haven't done any tillage on the soil because I couldn't see any positive effect from it. The good part about it is, and James, you talked about plowing under carbon. I don't plow, and you don't have to plow those plant matters under. My soil is so alive, and I wanted to show everybody this in the beginning, that out there in my cornfield, even though I had a 7-way mix of cover crops last year growing in a tremendous manner, today there's probably less than 50% coverage of the soil. My problem is my soil is so active. There's so many microbes in there doing so much to digest that plant matter that I'm having a rough time growing enough to protect the top of the soil. Whoops, you're muted.
Sorry, I'm muted. Rookie mistake there. So you never till at this point? Or do you till every 5 years, or just not at all anymore?
Not at all. I have, on occasion during the last couple decades, tilled when I tiled a field. I put tile down the ground, that leaves a lot of trenches, and I tried that on 2 occasions to level it out and saw a decrease in my yield. And so I've stayed away from that. We just do a good job of trying to get those trenches covered and then put up with the bumps and farm slower across the field.
Got it. All right. Well, thank you for that. I mean, most of what I'm hearing about so far, in terms of there's this separate discussion now about how do we incentivize farmers to undertake these sorts of practices. While you seem to be doing it because, well, tell me what's the incentive for you? You just think it's a more productive way of doing things.
Well, I look at Mother Nature and try to emulate what Mother Nature does.
Okay.
And Mother Nature never put a plow to the soil and constructed all these soils that we have out here. And the soil has, if you take I thought a teaspoon, maybe it's a tablespoon of soil, there's as many microorganisms in there. The population of it is as much as people on the face of the earth. Now, these are microscopic one-celled organisms, many of them, some of them larger. And if you have a good mix of all those, they pretty much take care of themselves. In my case, I rotate my soil. Many of my neighbors have problems with nematodes. There are certain nematodes, there are actually thousands of different kinds of nematodes. But in my soil, I have a large variety of them, and some of those nematodes are literally carnivorous. They eat other nematodes. And if you have a balanced population of them, they won't overwhelm your crop. Some of them favor corn, so if you grow continuous corn, you're feeding the nematodes, you get a large population of them, and then what do you have? You have problems with them. By rotating crops, I kind of stay away from that problem.
Got it. So, some number of farmers may undertake these sort of practices because they see a direct benefit in their productivity. Some may do it because they just care about environmental issues. But we're also talking about the question is how could we sort of bring about these sorts of practices at scale? A lot of the conversation right now revolves around questions of whether we can set up various sort of offset programs that could potentially do this. RIPE, however, is pushing kind of a different approach that would compensate farmers for a whole array of contributions that they make to healthy ecosystems, not just soil. Aliza, can you kind of describe your vision there and where you're at in terms of where you're at in terms of this proposed pilot effort?
Sure. Thanks, James. Yeah, we at RIPE are looking to help farmers invest in practices such as conservation tillage and other cover crop and other climate smart practices, and take a different approach rather than focusing on just that carbon value, but really looking at the full array of benefits that farmers are contributing to society. So when Phil adopts this no-till, he's providing carbon value as well as water quality and water conservation, soil health, and air quality. And when we limit it to the strict concept of offsets, he would not get compensated for that, right? Because he's an early adopter. He's taken the initiative and has really been a leader in the field. And he would be penalized under a system that takes that concept of additionality to the extent of saying, if we create a government program that's looking to adopt at scale, he would not be fairly compensated. And we don't think that's appropriate. We think that early adopters should be rewarded, as well as looking at a system that can bring it to scale to all farmers. And when we look at the current system of carbon farming compensation and what's being talked about in DC, it's really quite limited in terms of penalizing early actors and not bringing the payment level to a point where it would actually be incenting wide adoption. When you look at the cost share model that the federal government uses for conservation programs, and that some people in DC are talking about using for a potential climate bill, it would only be giving part of the practice cost to farmers, leaving them to foot the bill for the rest of it, which doesn't make sense. The farming sector is an incredibly financially stressed sector, and this is providing a tremendous amount of value to society. So our proposal and what we're advancing is to compensate farmers for the carbon, water, air, and that full stacked value of that process. So we're in conversation with folks such as Phil, who we're delighted to have on our steering committee, as well as some of his peers who are on state commodity trade associations across the country, to talk through how can we design those payments and put forth a first choice policy design for farmers that they can get excited about and champion, rather than this carbon farming concept that has been around for over 20 years. And farmers are, while certainly happy to take some amount of compensation, it's better than nothing. It's not enough to cover the cost of climate policy, and oftentimes not even enough to cover the cost of the practice itself. So will not be achieving a scaled level of adoption, nor will it achieve the broad coalition that's needed to advance a federal climate policy.
Okay. And so your model is to essentially provide direct payments to farmers for undertaking these practices. How are individual farms, how are their results or demonstrated or verified under your approach?
Sure. So we think that broad program-wide science-based evidence should be used to design payments. So the way that current conservation programs, EQEP and CSP, are designed is they don't go onto any individual one farmer's field and measure it for exact. They say, on average, looking at the scientific literature, we find that these practices provide this much value to soil, water, and other benefits, and therefore we try to use that to generally estimate a value. So we think that that's the approach that we should be taking. When you look at the value, it is so significant that what we want to aim for is to get as close to that level of public benefit that we can afford as a society. But we don't think that it's necessary to do the farm level measurement and verification. That's incredibly costly and has generally not proven out to be worthwhile for farmers.
But I mean, I'm sure that there are a lot of people operating in good faith that we can trust that, you know, they say they're doing these things and therefore they are doing these things. But, you know, it being a business and human reality being what it is, so, you know, there might be some funny business. So, I mean, how do we account for that? How do we know whether individual farms that say they're undertaking these practices are undertaking these practices and doing it in the right way, where that we know would have the sorts of results we're hoping for?
Absolutely. Appropriate government oversight is necessary, and USDA, we believe, can have oversight of auditing 1 to 5% of fields. That's what they currently do, and has generally been really successful. There's been very high compliance, and if it ever is found that a farmer has not adopted the practice, they could be given another year to adopt it, because a lot of times things are outside of their control. If there's a flood one year and they can't get around to installing it, give them another year to do it, and if they haven't done it in 2 years, they can return those funds to a government program. The overwhelming majority of government programs that we have in our country in every field are not measured and verified in the way that the carbon offset field has. It's an incredibly intense, invasive level of verification that has been discussed in the offset concept, and there's really no need for that. It's not the way we design education. We don't have cameras in every teacher's room. We don't have cameras in every hospital bed. We have regular government oversight with audit authority to go in and make sure that programs are operating, and when they're not, they make program adjustments, and we think that's the appropriate level for farmers adopting stewardship practices.
Got it. Okay. And just to sort of get into the state of things right now, we do have major companies like General Mills and Kellogg saying that they're going to start directing their suppliers to take these sorts of steps. We have other companies like Microsoft and Shell saying that they're going to increasingly be looking at soil carbon as one category for carbon offset purchases. We have some offsets registries that are working to establish protocols for accrediting soil carbon offsets for farmers. So the specific steps you would need to take to be able to sell into carbon markets. And we even have a rare bipartisan federal climate bill, the Growing Climate Solutions Act, that would allow farmers to sell credits into voluntary carbon markets. So I want to segue here into Dan. You wrote a piece in March where you on the one hand did highlight the potential of soil, but you warn of soil carbon techniques, but you warned that we could also end up overestimating how much additional CO2 we're actually and permanently storing. Can you provide a couple clear examples of ways that could happen and why that's something we should be concerned about here?
Of course. I think I'll highlight really 2 different ways in which we could overestimate the benefits. So the first has to do with permanence. It's a classic principle of carbon accounting that we want to account for how long any kind of carbon that's removed from the atmosphere will stay removed. And with soil carbon practices, there are many practices where we know based on survey research and other research that the practices sometimes stop after a couple of years, or there are other ways in which the carbon can be released from the soil. So for instance, I think it's amazing, Phil, that you've been practicing no-till basically consistently for the past 25 years, but at a broader level, USDA has found that almost a third of farmers typically will practice no-till for a few years, then till their soil again, then practice no-till again, go back and forth. And whenever they do till the soil, they release much of the carbon that has been sequestered. And this can be an issue with other farming practices as well, with cover crops. And we've seen this issue of permanence really rock the carbon offsets market when it comes to forest carbon offsets. Certainly, it's more plain than ever today that forest carbon projects can basically evaporate in smoke due to wildfire. And although this is probably rare in farming, we can see this happen as well in some areas, some agricultural areas where today some farmland is also certainly undergoing major change due to wildfire. And again, it's very difficult to predict, especially more urban areas in the future, what farmland might be developed or otherwise change 10 years down the line, potentially reversing some of the soil carbon sequestration that's happening today. But the other big problem or major way in which we can overestimate the benefits, I think, is less understood and less addressed. And that's the problem with really unintended consequences from some carbon farming practices, especially indirect land use change. People have talked a lot about the indirect land use change effects of biofuels, but it hasn't really happened as much with some of these carbon farming efforts. There are some practices that are incentivized by some of these corporations buying carbon offsets or government programs that promote farmers to turn some of their land into vegetative strips, for instance, between farms, by rivers, or to adopt practices that can reduce their yields. And although some of these can be very beneficial at the local level, in a world in which food demand is constantly growing, if we take some farmland out of production, make it less productive, that's going to encourage other farmers elsewhere to take up the slack and convert more land into farmland and release that carbon. So we really need to take that into account in any type of carbon initiative that is designed.
Dan, can I talk now?
Oh, please, go ahead.
A lot of what you're talking about, Dan, is individual practices. Now, in my case, this fall, I'm going to install some squirt membranes, which actually hold their water conservation membranes. I have a field of 40 acres, which has wheat going all the way from 100 bushel the acre down to nothing at some places. And the problem is that there's sand dunes there. And if I put these squirt membranes in at about 30 inches of depth, they will hold the water in the soil that normally would have drained through, and it'll be there available for the plant. And we put them down deep enough so that the water does not move to the top of the soil through capillary action, and that saves it. It also holds all the fertilizer in the soil there, and the plants use it. The other part about that sort of a thing is that it is the water that's right there, that fell on my land. I'm not taking water from someplace else and irrigating the land. And a large part of the water we have today, which is getting to be a limited resource, is used for agriculture, for growing crops. We have to look at the individual practice to see whether or not it truly is benefiting the carbon.
And Dan, I'm curious, I mean, are we talking about the issues that you raised, and they're the ones you both mentioned, and there are other ones we didn't get through? I mean, is the concern here is just that soil carbon sequestration isn't as potentially helpful as we would like, or as we're estimating? or do you see scenarios where we could actually, by virtue of instituting these sorts of programs, offsets, et cetera, that we could end up in a worse case than doing nothing at all, where we're actually, particularly through the offsets programs, on the one hand, if we're overestimating the amount that's actually of additional uptake that's actually happening on the farms, but allowing corporations to use this as permission to continue emitting at the same rate as in the past, could we actually find ourselves in situations where the total emissions have actually gone up despite the best intentions of these sorts of programs?
I think it's possible. I don't think it's likely. I'd be curious to hear what you think as well, Aliza. But my concern and the way in which this could happen is if the industry of carbon offsets, specifically related to soil carbon, is either not regulated or is just simply not well assessed and monitored by civil society, then there is the possibility for companies, especially offset buyers, to influence the development of offset mechanisms, or for offset providers, people who are in the business of working with farmers to implement specific changes and then sell the soil carbon offsets, for them as well to influence the development of offset programs in ways that water down the quality of those offsets. And if that happens, then there is definitely a chance that a ton of carbon that's sequestered on paper is not actually an actual ton of carbon sequestered, but companies that are buying offsets are going to keep emitting greenhouse gas emissions, and we don't want them to basically get away with more than they're really paying for when it comes to the offset market.
Right. And Aliza, did you want to share any additional thoughts on that point?
Sure. I think first I just want to make the distinction about the offset market and the private sector that's trying to offset their emissions, and any policy that's designed specific as an environmental quality trading program. It makes perfect sense to have strict verification guidelines. We're not opposed to that. We think that makes perfect sense, and that's where the history of the conversation has come. And where we're focused is on a future policy that would be looking broadly to adopt climate smart practices, and why we think we can design that program in a different way that's not allowing a regulated entity to pollute more, and therefore we don't need to be as precise about the verification. So I just wanted to clarify that. And then on Dan's point about yield, we learned a lot from Dan's research and really thought hard about his insights about the yield trade-offs, and think that that's a really valuable contribution to the field. One of the concerns for us is when you think about designing a federal climate policy, you can't be incenting increased yield, because that would be a violation of WTO trade laws. So I think one way that we can try to address this and take that insight into account is to try to think about innovation-based payment designs that would not penalize yield, but leave the yield issue to the private market, which has its own incentives of designing that. But for a climate policy program at the federal level, it would be problematic to explicitly design yield, but I think it's important to keep that insight in mind, as the Breakthrough Institute has really thoughtfully done so.
And Phil, as a working farmer and someone who I'm imagining is having conversations with a lot of other working farmers, I'm curious about your perspectives on the policy and incentives side of all of this. What proposals for promoting these sorts of practices do you think seem feasible and workable from your perspective?
In talking with farmers, I personally, just me, think that going through the present government institutions is not the way to incentivize this. If you want to really get a lot of people into it, you need to go through the same type of structure in which we sell crop insurance. The crop insurance agents that are out there selling crop insurance have, in my perception, is that they get paid more when they sell more crop insurance, get more people involved, that they have, they're in deep trouble if their people that they sign up for crop insurance do in fact fraud the government. And those things where they have skin in the game is something that will help this program to be adopted more along the line. If there's an agent out there who has skin in the game, gets rewarded for having a lot of people sign up and gets penalized for those people who misuse the system. We need that type of a system because because somebody needs to kind of push the programs and push the farmers or help to educate them on how to do this stuff and make it available to them.
Okay. What's your read of that, the federal climate bill that I was referencing earlier? Is that something you've looked at and have any thoughts on?
I have not looked at the federal climate bill or the one you're referring to know what it says and what it's about.
Fair enough. Coming back to Dan, some of the researchers that I've talked to working in this space who've particularly taken a close look at sort of like the offset side of this have basically said that, the models here are, the science here is pretty early. For sure, we know that soil can capture, a lot more carbon than it is, that it's lost a lot over the decades. But there's a lot more uncertainty when it comes to what soil types, what climate conditions, what techniques work from condition to condition and soil to soil best. And so the general conclusion I've heard is that, to really reliably estimate additional carbon uptake on like a ton for ton basis, which you would have to sort of do somewhat accurately for an offset program, you'd really have to do on the ground sampling. You need to do independent auditing. You'd have to monitor these things over time, all of which, as Aliza has pointed out, substantially raise the costs of these programs and on the cost for farmers. Dan, your piece that you wrote back in March seemed to take a different approach. You were basically arguing for this set of principles that could be applied that more or less boil down to the way to do it accurately, or that we're not going to be able to do it accurately. So instead, what we need to do is do it conservatively. That, to allow for substantial overestimation. Can you sort of just describe your thoughts on that and why that would essentially be necessary?
Yes. So there's two things. So first, I personally think that Aliza's proposal to measure the effectiveness of any carbon effort at more of the landscape scale or beyond just the single farm, it does get around many of the costs and many of the barriers of really assessing the effectiveness. It can be certainly cost prohibitive to measure and analyze how much carbon is being stored at the field level or the farm level, which I'm sure, Phil, you can attest to. So adopting more programmatic or program-wide assessment approach, similar to what USDA already does for many of its programs, that does seem much more promising to me. So that's one piece of this. And two, the principle of conservativeness is a long-standing principle of carbon offset markets, and I think it is often overlooked and simply needs to be emphasized and kind of maintained throughout any new soil carbon efforts. Offset registries and others who develop offset projects typically will already assume that a certain portion of the carbon that is removed in any type of project will be re-released. They have different assumptions for different offset protocols. This varies quite widely. Some are more conservative than others. But overall, we need to really take seriously the risks of soil carbon being re-released, sequestration being reversed, when practices change or the climate in the region changes. And that principle of conservativeness is one great way to do that.
Okay. I think we're going to turn to audience Q&A in a few minutes, so please do get your questions over to us if you have them, and if someone could start sending me the questions that you particularly want me to ask, that would be great. One point that that I think does often get lost in the coverage of this issue and the debate around it, and I know it's something that people have yelled at me about on Twitter after I have written some of my stories, is that carbon is not the only benefit to these sorts of practices, and so this could be a little bit, we can be sort of being overly reductive and simplistic here. So Aliza, can you talk a little bit about, the broader benefits potentially of undertaking some of these practices that go beyond the sort of ton per ton additional carbon uptake?
Absolutely, yeah, thanks, James. So core to our concept is to take a look at that stacked ecosystem service value. So this chart here shows on the left is the cost of climate policy. So for an acre of corn, looking at the House Select Committee on Climate Crisis, Climate Model, Climate Plan, it would be roughly about $33 an acre in cost and input increases. And then if they were to adopt cover crops, that would be an additional $27 per acre. So it's a cost of $60. A carbon farming payment would be about $18, priced at that 54 a ton level. So the value to society from carbon is about $18 per acre. But then when you look at that same cover crop value to society, in terms of water quality, it's an extra $50, soil health $21, water conservation $19, air quality $7. So cover crops provides $115 per acre of public value. And when we limit the conversation to only thinking about the carbon value, we're talking about a small fraction of that value. So that's why as a society, we think we should be taking this broader look. Our water issues, our soil, our air are really essential to our broad sustainability effort. And so we think this is an important frame to be looking at to provide an alignment between the public value that we're receiving and what farmers are fairly compensated for.
And Phil, did you have any additional thoughts on that particular issue, the sort of broader benefits of these sorts of practices?
In agriculture, we've known for a long time that the topsoil we're losing, part of that topsoil is organic matter, is carbon that we've been losing. And we need to, I believe personally, that we need to address this thing so we keep the productivity, natural productivity of our soil at a high level, and we need to do a lot of these things to benefit the ability of that soil to produce. What exactly were you asking about the stacked idea?
Well, no, I mean, not necessarily. I'm just was curious about, and I think you answered it, but just beyond, additional carbon uptake in the soils, what are the broader reasons for doing this in terms of whether it's environmental sustainability generally or the health of your soil, lack of erosion, etc. I think you hit some of those points, but anything else you'd add?
Well, today in agriculture, every time you pick up a magazine, there's usually an article, at least 90% of the time, about regenerative agriculture or something similar to it. I came up with one here on a farmer with 7,000 acres, large scale. He's saving $670,000 a year because of reduced diesel, reduced synthetic nitrogen, reduced potash, reduced lime, reduced MAP, that's a fertilizer, and reduced chemical applications. The majority of these things are very heavily dependent on the price of petroleum, because there's a lot of energy used to make the fertilizers and the diesel itself. Part of your problem is that the petroleum industry won't like to see this sort of thing come down. But the petroleum industry is where a lot of our carbon comes from. It's mined out of the soil and goes up into the air, and it's been down there for years and years and years. And I hate to say that, being as how I'm a petroleum producer myself, but hey, that is the way it is.
Right. Okay. I'm now going to turn to some audience questions. And I'm not sure if I know who I can say who these are coming from because they've been filtered, but how can we ensure that carbon stays in soils long enough to matter on climate relevant timescales? Offsets protocols assume that 100 years of sequestration delivers equivalent benefits to permanent emissions reductions, but I'd argue that isn't long enough considering CO2's long atmospheric residence time. Dan, would you want to take that one on to start?
It's a great question. I honestly don't know. I think that there is a wide variety of different perspectives on the timescales that matter, and it's essentially a societal and political choice more so than anything else. I think most politicians most climate policy designers are more focused on the 2030 year time frame than anything else. But certainly, we all know that our children and grandchildren will be around past 2100, and the climate then matters as well.
Right. Aliza, any other thoughts on that one?
Two thoughts. One is you could ask the same thing on the energy side, and the other is we agree that there's generally a concern about it, and that's why we think it's important to look at the broader benefits, which are real. And if you look at the House climate plan, the quantified greenhouse gas reductions that they're expecting from agriculture is really small. I think they take this issue seriously in terms of what the potential is. And that should be something that we take into account, but also consider, the water quality issues, the water conservation issues that we have as a country are so significant right now. And agriculture has a tremendous role to play in reducing our flooding, in conserving our water, improving our water quality, and that we think those are critical issues that we should be including and not throw the baby out with the bathwater because of the technical issue around the quantification of greenhouse gas. I would argue that the quantification of greenhouse gas in agriculture, the people who are very focused on that, I would call them carbon bean counter hawks. And they've had a really outsized play in terms of just thinking about our federal climate policy, and that piece of the policy design needs to be put in the context of our national context of needing to have a bipartisan climate coalition. So we need to keep on the technical issues, but put it in context of what do we need as a society to move forward. And I think those technical issues can continue to be addressed in the R&D phase of the world, but look more broadly about what we need as a society to design a climate policy that works for all.
One more thing to add as well is that emissions reductions typically are permanent, and there are many opportunities for emissions reductions in agriculture. In addition to just storing more carbon in the soil, there are great opportunities to reduce emissions from manure, from cattle, from fertilizers, and especially reducing those emissions from manure and fertilizers also have many air quality benefits and water quality benefits as well, in addition to their greenhouse gas benefits. So I don't want to lose sight of that just by focusing, as narrowly as many people do on soil carbon.
And many of those things are happening now there in the world of agriculture as we speak. Many of the large dairies out there have their own storage program for their manure. They've laid pipelines to move that effluent out to the fields, to put it on the soil, to use it for fertilizer. Many farmers are getting into soil testing on a grid basis, 2.5 acres or 1 acre, and testing them. And because they do this, because they can more than pay for the cost of the sampling in what they save in fertilizer. And I've gotten into that for the same reason. I am cutting down on my fertilizer usage. By the way, I'm in the Lake Erie watershed. Many of you know that Lake Erie had an algae bloom, which because the city of Toledo was not ready for it, they took in some algae, some toxins into their water system and closed down the water system. It resulted in quite a panic. I'm just a hop, skip, and a jump from Ann Arbor. They actually had to call out the police to ration out bottled water to people coming up from Toledo buying water. I mean, there are things here that are really touching people. And a lot of this has to do with changing the whole attitude of farmers. I learned how to farm from my dad. We tilled the soil and we did this and we did that. And it'll take time to change those attitudes and those practices. But if you change them and people learn how to do that and they are productive, they will stay. Do it.
And if I could Add one thing. I think the concept about needing R&D that Breakthrough Institute has really been at the forefront of, I think we really agree is important in terms of thinking about how do we really achieve significant scaled agricultural greenhouse gas reductions. We do need R&D. And one way that we can address that is to say, well, let's set in place a federal policy that will incent innovation and provide that market signal that we want to see these advances that are needed to be able to see that scale. And that can be done in a regulatory phase of a climate policy that sets in place that structure and then moves the market forward. And so in the meantime, we can compensate the practices that we know are beneficial for climate and water and not get caught up in, well, it's not a huge scale right now, but we can create an incentive for the practices that will eventually, hopefully emerge with scale.
Aliza, National Corn Growers has what they call Soil Health Partnership, in which they go out and they do a very intensive amount of sampling of farmers' field. And he will divide the field in half, and one half he will try these new practices on, the other half do what he was doing before. And the farmer decides what practices he wants to put out there. And they're looking at the changes in the soil over the years. Yes, those type of things out there in the field are going to mean a lot and show us a lot of what can and cannot be done.
To move on to a totally different topic, one of our audience members is curious about enhanced rock weathering with farmers. I know there's been, this is sort of taking things to almost an additional step here. I know there's been some research into sort of plowing in certain types of rocks or minerals into the soils that can sort of magnify the ability for the soils to capture carbon. I don't know, anyone want to weigh in on that? Has anyone looked at that and the potential of that?
I have no idea what you're talking about.
Fair enough.
I think to maybe take Aliza's point a little bit further, jumping off of that question about enhanced rock weathering, I think that is a great example of the importance for public sector agricultural research and development funding. It's possible to imagine the private sector, if there's some type of carbon market, investing funds to research enhanced rock weathering. However, the timescale necessary for these research projects and programs is usually much too long for the private sector to find it worthwhile. So for something like that, even if there's a market, there's still going to be an enormous role to play for USDA, for DOE, NSF, and other federal research agencies to research enhanced rock weathering and all of these other exciting opportunities, such as breeding crops that sequester more carbon, and all of these other technological options that folks are researching right now.
Okay. Our friend Sam Evans-Brown has a question. In my reporting on carbon offset protocol regimes, the general takeaway I have come away with is that there's no actor who has an incentive to actually design a conservative protocol. How do we cope with this? This, by the way, lines up with something I've been told a lot in my reporting as well, that all of the incentives are sort of work on one side of this problem, that from policymakers to farmers to the registry systems themselves to the groups that are creating carbon markets, the incentives all run toward creating as many of these offsets as possible. So pushing toward a quantity rather than quality. And this is a problem that's not just specific to soil, but sort of all offsets. Aliza, what are your thoughts on that and how we potentially can kind of counter that imbalance in the incentives to make sure that we're doing this in an appropriate way and a way where we're not just sort of overvaluing overestimating the benefit of what's actually happening?
I think that's a question that's fair for those who are designing offset protocols, and to be particular about that. I think that makes a lot of sense. I would say, we're really trying to shift away from that in terms of thinking about a federal climate policy and how to engage agriculture because of the significant water, soil, and other benefits that they provide. So I think I would leave that issue to those who are working on more of a quality trading program where they need to be that precise.
Dan, any thoughts on that?
It's one of the main reasons I'm really skeptical of private voluntary carbon markets. I think that the problem with incentives is one of the main reasons why it's so important for federal policymakers to really, step forward and expand or create the types of programs that Aliza is discussing.
Yeah.
Um,
What about technological solutions? This is a question we got on the question of verification. Can Internet of Things sensors or drones or satellite surveillance be used for measuring measuring these things in a more accurate way? I've actually, again, like in terms of my reporting, what I've heard, I'm hearing more. There are some startups that are looking into doing this more on the forestry side of things. I don't think that satellite sensors at this point can actually measure soil carbon uptake, but I could be wrong. Are those a practical way of improving our estimates in a more affordable way potentially? Anyone?
I think maybe the biggest benefit we can garner from technology is better monitoring farms. This is something that we're seeing happen across different offset organizations and developers. They're increasingly using aerial imagery, whether it's from drones or satellites, to measure, just monitor who is adopting the cover crops that they say they're adopting. And similarly for no-till agriculture, that's something you can monitor from basically using aerial imagery. There are some efforts as well. I think there's one from Yale, Rapid Carbon, to develop lower cost, more effective soil carbon measurement tools. And there's a number of kind of private company initiatives along those lines as well. And I think those will only make it easier to measure carbon, assess how effective these programs are.
I would just add to that, to put on your political hat for a moment and think about what does it sound like for government to go out and say, we are going to put sensors covering every farmer's field. You're going to have massive pushback from farmers. And I think it's really important to think about that and thinking about how to design a policy. I do think that there's a potential from a very voluntary way, where if the government were to say, we'll have an offering of an incentive, a bonus payment that is generous, if a farmer can demonstrate that they're providing some significant reductions in greenhouse gas and other valuable services, and then it's up to the farmer to decide if they want to agree to that monitoring or not. But if the government were to go forth with the sensor every farmer field, you're going to have such a tremendous pushback that I don't think the climate policy movement, which has zero support on the Republican side right now, can afford. So I think it's important to keep that in mind.
Yeah. We have a few questions that are some version of how hard is this for farmers? Phil, how difficult and costly is it to implement some of these practices that we're talking about?
Oh, okay. I've been following several farmers heading the same way I am, and a number of them have said they started reducing inputs because the inputs were too expensive. And as they gradually worked into it and they learned how to handle this type of a system. This is totally different than what we grew up doing. So it's a learning curve there that they found it to be more profitable. I've gone to a no-till seminar. We have no-till magazines. There's a lot of things in agriculture right now that are brewing, and people are coming up with new ideas around these sorts of things. Part of the problem in adapting them is that it means using fewer petroleum products, less steel, less equipment, less pesticides, and there are a lot of industries out there that make money selling these things. And that is part of the problem because they're advertising them and farmers are not incentivized to try the new things. The next thing that's happening out here is a big breakthrough in the understanding of the role that microbes play in our soils. You go to a corn meeting, a national corn meeting, where they have people out there with their wares and telling you about things, and there's oodles of people that have claimed they found microbes that'll do this and do that and do something else. Microbes that will go with the corn plant, fix nitrogen in the ground so you don't have to put artificial nitrogen on. microbes that trying to have lost some of them now, lost my train of thought. But there's a lot of concern about that and a lot of desire to do things that way within the industry. And the way I see it is if government helps to kind of push this along, that it'll help it to come to a better result.
Okay. Well, unfortunately, I failed in my moderating duties. We've actually gone a little bit past our hard stop here. So we are going to wrap up at this point. But thanks to all the panelists for taking the time to discuss this issue today. I really appreciate it. Really fascinating conversation. And thanks to all the audience members who listened in and provided questions for the panel.